and I'm hoping you're going to be hearing me. We've got the microphone on here, so if anybody can't hear me, just let me know, and I'll try and do something with that. It's called A View of Old Burton, but of course, one person's view of old is not the same as everyone else's. I'm getting on in years, and the things that I remember as being old are practically ancient to some people. So please forgive me if I talk as though it's yesterday, and really it's too far longer ago than you can remember. But I'll do my best to explain things as we go along. I'm going to start in the centre of Burton Latimer. This is the cross. We know this is pre-1922 because there's no war memorial there. The cross, because it's a crossroads, it was always a central point for people to gather. Like this in 1911 at the coronation of King George V. Lots of people, some lovely hats down here in the foreground, and I think somewhere here there's a horse and cart. These buildings on the left-hand side here are still there, but the ones on the right have all disappeared. Apart from these, this one, I better say, can you see my red point? You see the top? Okay. That one there, that's the corner of Bakehouse Lane. This is November 1922, and the erection, the unveiling of the War Memorial. It's now 100 years since the War Memorial was placed there. As you can see, there's an enormous crowd there, which is not surprising because over 500 men went from Burton Latimer to serve in the First World War, and the 104 didn't come back. So that's 1 in 5 of the men that fought were killed, and a lot of others were maimed. The photograph on the left is the day after the unveiling, and you can see that huge pile of wreaths. The Kettering leader the next day gave a list of all the names that were on the War Memorial, and someone went round and took all the inscriptions off of the notes or the dedications on the wreaths, and they're all there. And luckily, we've been able to transcribe them, they're all on our website. This is the War Memorial now, of course. It's a Grade 2 listed monument. We've got quite a lot of Grade 2, Grade 1 and 2 listed buildings in Burton Latimer, and I'm going to concentrate on them for the first half of the talk. Moving down into Church Street, this is was the old infant school. At the time of this photo, this is Mr. Talbot's bakehouse, that some of you with longer memories will remember it as being Captain's Bakehouse. Excuse me. And there's the old rectory in the background. All this has now disappeared, of course. This building is still there, but the rest has disappeared. This is the Church of England Infant School in 1948. The school was founded in 1587, but not built until 1622. The foundation still exists. It's called the Burton Latimer United Education Foundation, and it still makes grants to young people for further education. So that's all those years it's been making grants to Burton Latimer young people. And this is what it looks like today. It's the two chimneys on each end have been lowered, an extra one put in the middle, and now you see it's thatched. Across, just away over the Preston Court is the schoolhouse, built in, I think, in the 1850s for the school, the head teacher. That's a Grade 2 listed building as well. Mr. Borden was one of the head teachers, and here he is looking over his hedge, with Mrs. Borden looking out of the window and three daughters looking through the gate. They had a son as well, but sadly he was killed in a railway accident somewhere in Derbyshire. Across the road is the manor house. This, it is said, was built on the site of a Saxon Thames homestead, and there are ditches and all sorts of things which have led people to say that. This is the back of the house in 1948, a photo taken from Historic England. It's thought that it actually was once the front of the house. It's far more imposing than the other side of it. And there was a date stone of 1704 up here somewhere, and some initials. And it's thought that this was the front, and it was approached from a gateway in what is now Church Lane. This photograph was taken from we think from the rear of the assembly rooms here in Meeting Lane. It was taken at the beginning of the Second World War by a soldier. It's been coloured since, but it shows the fact that the manor house was on a mound, and really it's a good defensive position if it was ever attacked, I suppose, back in the days of the Saxons. This is a 2014 photograph of the manor house with its beautiful gardens here. This was when it was on the market. It was eventually sold for £1,300,000, and I was looking today, and they now think it's increased in value by £500,000, so that puts it over £2 million. St Mary's Church in the snow in 2014. Now, of course, St Mary's is a Grade 1 listed building. Now, I confess now that I don't know anything about architecture. The late Douglas Ashby used to reel off all sorts of facts about what period they were and the sort of windows they are. I'm afraid I'm not up to that. But I do know that it's got some Norman architecture inside it, and it dates from the 1100s. One of the other listed buildings or other listed monuments is this gravestone to Thomas Blofield, who died in 1735, which is in the churchyard. He was from a long line of carpenters, one of whom was involved in making the church chest, the parish chest here, which is in the church, and dated 1629. There are a long line of carpenters, and there was a blacksmith by the name of Coleman who also helped with the ironwork. Across Church Lane is Fernbank. Douglas Ashby in his book said that this is Mrs. Williamson, or Mrs. Williams, and these are Harper ladies. It's completely different from what it looks like today, and I sometimes doubted whether this was Fernbank. Here's another photo of it. A wing has been added facing the garden, and it looks like an extension put on the front. And really, I wondered whether it was it. This is the photo I took myself in about 2006. And if you notice this stonework on the corner here, it corresponds with the stonework there. So that now, it solved that problem. This is Fernbank without the wing that overlooks the garden. Mr. Lope was a long-time resident there, and he was famous for his delphiniums, and he used to open the garden for delphinium lovers that would come from all over the country to look at them. And of course, Charlie Hull is the new owner there, and here she is in the garden on her wedding day. Across the road in Church Street was the rectory. It wasn't listed. Generally speaking, Historic England didn't list buildings until the early 1970s, and this was demolished in 1971. Whether it would have saved it or not, goodness knows, I don't know. But it was a substantial building and also in substantial grounds. This is the rear of the property. You can tell the size of the property in its grounds by the fact that Church View, there are 20-odd houses, I think, in Church View, all with decent-sized gardens, and they all fit into the garden of this house. Across the road is number 16 Church Street, known to most people as Garlick's. He was there from 1947 to the early 1980s. Thatched when this photo was taken, but then now, of course, it's slated. But you can see where the thatching was by the outline of this roof here. Then further along, we've got number 24 Church Street and number 30 Church Street. They look both very similar. Both have got date stones. Some, I think they're worn away now, but I think they're dated 1600 and something. Both quite imposing houses. Across the road from those is Sunnyside Farm, number 73 Church Street. This photograph was taken in the early 1900s, I imagine, and I think that's Mr. Border, the head teacher there, and this is Sunday school parade of some sort, I would think. And it's now named Beach House. It's where Nicky Lope lives. Up the street a little bit further is number 79. This is another listed building, which has had an excellent story. If you notice, the stonework on this lower half, the ground floor and the first floor, the stonework is quite different from the top floor, and obviously has been added. Go on a bit further and you come to this scene. This is Windmill Farm, and this is Batty's Row. It started off as Battle's Row when Mr. Battle from Cranford had a maltings. He was a brewer and had a maltings over this side here, out of sight here. But then that closed down and Mr. Batty took it over as a tannery. And Battle's Row became Batty's Row. However, this house here, Windmill Farm, Grade 2 listed building, it's been in the Ackfield, been lived in by the Ackfield since the 1880s. The first Mr. Ackfield came to Burton Latimer as the farm bailiff for the rector, and the family's been here ever since. It's called Windmill Farm. Well, some people might think it's because of the wind turbine, but of course it's not. When this house was built, when the windmill was built, that house was there. But this is the windmill, which is the other side of the A6 of the Burton Latimer bypass now. And when that, one stage, I would imagine you could probably see this windmill from the farm. There being no housing in Cranford Road, no George Street, no Spinney Road or anything like that to get in the way. And you can have a clear view of the windmill from the farm. I should say that these cottages are still there. They're much improved, of course. The cottages are still there, but the windmill disappeared, was taken down, I believe, I was told something like 1914. And these buildings here were the offices for the Burton Latimer Iron Company. Another farmhouse in Church Street, the Laurels, on the corner of Church Street and Wold Road. The last farmer, I think, that lived there was the Stopses. Just trying to think of his name. Anyway, the Stopses. And this is the view looking down Wold Road with the farmhouse here and the farm buildings here. These farm buildings were converted into domestic dwellings. I think there are 2 or 3 houses here now. This is the view down Wold Road now. Further along down Wold Road are these farm houses built for people that worked at Wold Farm, which is further on. The Culver houses lived here for many years, and I've forgotten the name. But then carry on, you come to Wold Farm, another working farm still. This is an aerial photo from the 1960s. And this is the ground when the Downs lived there. Now carrying on along Wold Road, it doesn't go, it's not a proper road until you come here, but you do eventually reach the Hindon to Thrapston Road. And this is the Waterloo Victory, the panorama. Apparently, the owner of the farm, Colonel Arbuthnot, was a friend of the Duke of Wellington, and the Duke of Wellington visited him, and looking from here over towards Burton Latimer, he said it reminded him of the fields of Waterloo. And then Mr. Arbuthnot had this tower built and called it the Panorama of Waterloo Victory, AD 1815. It was a pub for some time, a very unruly pub. I think the problem was that it was on the boundary between Burton Latimer, Hindon, Addington, and I think Cranford. And the police couldn't make up their minds who was responsible for it. But it was so disreputable that it was closed down in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's been farmed. The Corney family have farmed here since 1934, making them one of the Burton Latimers. It is officially in Burton Latimer, but with those and the Atfields and the Bennies, who came here in the 1930s. This is the late Duncan Benny feeding his stock. He lived in Home Farm, Kettering Road, a Grade 2 listed building. It's called Home Farm now. It was Rectory Farm because it belonged to the rector at the time. But I think the Hartleys bought it in the 1930s, and Mr. Benny moved in. Now and again on eBay we get photos, or even Facebook we get photos coming up. And this photo was labelled as a farm, a Burton Latimer farm. It was far worse than this when I first looked at it. And I thought they'd got it wrong. And I thought, well, what is this building in the background? I couldn't think. But then it occurred to me that if you stand in the field opposite Home Farm and look through there, you see this building here, which is now Sunseeker in Station Road, and it's the old Ideal Clothing Factory, which opened in 1901. So that clinched it for me that yes, that definitely was Home Farm. This is Kettering Road along here, and Station Road up here, and there's a clear view in between the buildings of the Ideal. And there it is through there. When you know what you're looking at, you know what it is. St Mary's Church, of course, is Grade 1, and the other Grade 1 listed building is Burton Latimer Hall. It's thought that there was a medieval structure here before this was built. This was built in the early 1600s on the site of a medieval building. The Harpers moved here in 1760, and they, in the 1800s, built this wing here on the left-hand side. This is a photo before that, because there's no wing here on the right-hand side. The gateway is just here instead of further down, and it's got the air of a much earlier building. I don't think much has been done to it. That looks like a window there, which is now a door, but then you look at this one. This is obviously later. The Victorian addition is there. The front gate has been moved from this wall here. That's been filled in, and there's a front door there instead of a window. These are two members of the Harper family. One of the members of the family moved to British Columbia in the 1920s, and one of his descendants is quite active on Facebook. And I've got a feeling that this photograph came from him. And I think this is a gentleman that moved to Canada in the 1920s. Another photograph of the Harpers. This is the Reverend Latimer Harper. He wasn't the rector of Burton Latimer, he was the rector of Capthorpe over the Leicestershire border. He had a daughter, but I'm not sure whether this is the daughter or whether that's his housekeeper. He had a very dedicated housekeeper for very many years, and he erected, or the family erected, a gravestone with an inscription, which is against the wall in the Burton Latimer churchyard. Now, whether this chap is the butler or what, I don't know, but probably the gardener with a look at his trousers. He could do with a Corby press, I think, for his Christmas. Two more buildings associated with Burton Latimer Hall is the Dovecot, which is the listed building, and Hall Cottage, across the road from the hall. For many years, the hall gardener would live in this. We then come back down to this building. I think this is number 73 Kettering Road. This was built in the late 1700s. For many years, it was rented out to various tenants until the late 1890s, when Charles Barlow bought it. It's now, of course, a nursing home. And this was what it looked like in 1914 when Charles Barlow was living there. One of the residents was this Princess Keulani. She was there. She would have looked like this photograph on the left-hand side when she was living there. She came to be living there because she was a pupil at Harroden Ladies School. And when the head teacher retired, this princess had got nowhere to go in England, so she came to Burton Latimer to live with her at what is now called the Yews. She was a very beautiful young lady, looking at this, and she's revered in Hawaii due to the fact that she objected. She was opposed to the American annexation or occupation of Hawaii. And I understand that that America, whichever president it was, made an official apology to Hawaii for their actions in the late 1800s. And as far as I know, she is the only Burton Latimer resident ever to be on a postage stamp. just inside Station Road, number 9 Station Road, you won't recognise this photograph here, but you might recognise it through looking through the gate at this photograph here, showing this photograph here. It's a listed building, but one of its main interesting points is down here is a medieval window, which it's reckoned may have been brought from the building that was demolished when they built Burton Latimer Hall. They moved the medieval, they probably used quite a lot of stone in building this, and also a window. They can't take a photo of it, but it's so close to number 11 Station Road that I don't think they can take a decent photograph of it. But that's another listed building. Moving back down the High Street, we come to Doolittle Cottage, which is number 32 High Street. This is a photograph taken in the late 1950s, I believe. This was when it was occupied by Mr. Swan, who was the barber and tobacconist. To the right of it is Frank Barlow's butcher's shop, and to the left is Alfred Barlow's grocer's. And off picture here is where his wife had a draper's shop. Both of these were sons of Charles Barlow, who I mentioned lived in the Yeoman. Across the road, Osborne House. Now Linda will be able to tell you a lot more about Osborne House than I can. In fact, she doesn't talk about it. So if you want to know about Osborne House, ask Linda. She's at the back of the room. Oh, she's just behind me, is she? Right, but don't ask her yet. No, I think it was built started in the 1700s, belonging to the Catch family. And it's named Osborne House after James Osborne who lived there. It wasn't called Osborne House whilst he lived in it. This was called Osborne's Corner, but it was named Osborne House after he left, I understand. He was a farmer and a property owner in Burton Latimer. And in Meeting Lane, there's an Osborne's Row and an Osborne's Terrace. One of the residents was Dr. Kingsley. Some people in the room today will remember Dr. Kingsley. He was a GP here from 1934 to 1972, and he died there in 1986. Of course, Osborne House was the surgery. He had his surgery here, and from the 1930s, this was until 1972, when the health centre was built. That was Burton Latimer's surgery, and sometimes people would be queuing outside here, but you'd always be seen by Dr. Kingsley. Across the road in Meeting Lane is the Thatchers. This was a former pub, which I'll refer to a bit later on, and the Baptist Church here. Both the church is a listed building, but I don't think that is the Thatchers listed. No, it's not listed. This is an illustration from the Graphic magazine in 1872, entitled "Interior of a Village Inn, Burton Latimer," and it's thought that this is an interior of the Thatchers. This is when it was a pub in 1905. The landlord was Mr. Miller at the time, and this gentleman here is James Turner, I think his name was, who was a coal man delivering to Ellis and Everard's. But sadly, he was killed by his own horse and cart in 1916 when he was run over by it in Station Road. The pub was a 6-day-a-week pub. I suspect that when it was built, one of the conditions was that it didn't open on Sundays because of the proximity to the Baptist Church just here. And this is a photograph taken from the opposite direction. There's Osborne House in the background there. On the left here is what is now called Nutcracker Cottage, probably because of the low ceilings. There's a lintel over one of the fireplaces with a date of 1669 on it, which makes it a pretty ancient cottage and touched me to say, had I got any photographs of Meeting Lane. And I sent this one to her, and she came back straight away and said, well, you've got my great-grandmother and my grandmother on it. That's Mrs. Brown, and that's her daughter. Mrs. Maria Brown was the wife of a butler who worked away from Burton Latimer a lot, but she lived in Meeting. I don't think this is her house, because this house here was also, before Osborne House became occupied by doctors and was a surgery, this house here was a surgery. And the doctor came from Farringdon twice a week to hold surgeries here. And there is, when you magnify it, there is a plate on the walls here. Further along the end of Meeting Lane is the house called the Limes. This is another house belonging to John Yeoman's, and he bequeathed it to the Baptist Church, and it was used as the Baptist Church manse for a couple of hundred years until their own Victorian manse was built at the end of Meeting Lane in the 1890s, which is now incorporated into the John Yeoman's community hall there. This is Charles Stokes, who was a deacon of the Baptist Church at the time. This is what it looks like now. What it looks like now. This is a more recent photograph of it. I don't know what date it is, but that's a more recent photograph of it. Coming back into the High Street is Rosebank. This isn't a listed building. I sometimes wonder why, but we have an earlier photograph of it here. This is Rosebank in 1876. It was occupied by a Mr. James. Here he is in the front garden here. There's a carriage here with a young lad holding the horse's head. And if we take a close-up, I'm sorry it's not a terribly good picture, but that's Mr. James there, looks like holding a baby. That's his wife. And these are shop windows. And if you look at the top here, we've got Draper, James, Grocer. So this is the first photo of the first Burton Latimer shop that we've got, 1876. He must have done very well, because at the end of the 1800s he built this building here. And this is a double-fronted shop, and he also built a clothing factory at the rear. This is called by Burtonians Pagoda House because of the shape, presumably, of the top of the building here. This is a lovely photo. We like this. This is the red cow just here. There's a school in the background. I don't think we dare stand in the middle of the road like that today. Across the road is number 44 High Street. This is hidden away between the newsagents and the takeaway. I can't remember what it is, but it's a takeaway. This was also built in the late 1700s. In 1851, they found the body of a young lady underneath a path leading up to it. They were modernising in some way, and the body of the young lady was found there. Obviously, without forensics in those days, they couldn't tell who she was or how long she'd been there, but it was definitely that of a young female. And there were lots of stories repeated in the Northampton Mercury about what the villagers said who it was and why she was there. There was one theory that one gentleman who lived there had a companion who had a niece who was quite a wealthy niece, and the two of them had her knocked off because they wanted her money. But nothing was ever proved, and nobody will never know who she was. One family that did live there was the Quincy family. He was a very busy chap. He was clerk to the parish council. Well, he was clerk to the vestry, I think it was. He was also the enumerator. I think he was the enumerator in the 1861, 71 and 81 censuses in Burton Latimer. He was the landlord of the Red Cow, and he was a butcher, so he had his work cut out. And this is the Red Cow. This was well after he had it, but this is an early picture of the Red Cow, which is now, the site is now occupied, for those who don't know, with the Bewitched Coffee shop and Oscar James. Moving along the street, we come to Hilly Farm, another Grade 2 listed building. When this photograph was taken, it was occupied by Jesse Fox, and Mr. Jesse Fox. He was another busy man. Besides farming Hilly Farm, he was a publican. He was the landlord at the Horse and Groom in Bakehouse Lane, and he was also a miller owning the windmill which we saw earlier. How these people kept all these jobs down, I do not know. But then again, they haven't got television to take at the time. Just across the road from Hilly Farm is another farm, another home farm, but known to most Burton Latimer people as Dentist's Farm. This is a 1948 photograph. This is Edgar Denton, who some people may still remember. This is it in 1962, just before it was pulled down. You can see Churchill Way houses in the background there, and the poplars just there, the council offices. And Historic England took this photograph, and they also took these photographs of the interior. Which I was quite surprised at this. It looks quite elegant, doesn't it? You know. I never went inside. I think I once went into the kitchen, but never went any further. And I was surprised to see this. However, this is the roof space. Another Historic England photograph. Lots of rubbish in there. And an aerial photograph around about the same time during the building of Churchill Way. The farm, Denton's Farm garden is just down here in the bottom right-hand corner. There's the poplars, which was the council offices at the time. This would be where the car park is now, and the Bowls Club. Here's the cinema down here on the bottom left-hand corner. The bank right down the bottom here, and the Poplars Coach House. I don't know whether these were the public toilets at the time, but they were converted to public toilets at one stage. And we lost Denton Farm, and we got this instead. Necessary, I suppose, but not a very good spot, I don't think. I mentioned the Poplars. This is the photograph of Mr. Frederick Preston. He died in 1914, and his second wife, sitting in the carriage there, was Maria. She died in 1942. When she died, it was bought by Mr. A.G. Miller, who is seen here. The council were looking for larger premises at the time, and because it was wartime, they weren't allowed to spend any money, and so Mr. Miller bought it on behalf of the council, leased it to the council, and then sold it then the council bought it off of him after the war for the same price that he paid for it, which was very good. This is the opening in 1942. There's Bob Phillips there. Mr. Alfie Barlow there, the grocer that the shop we saw earlier on, Mr. Clipson, Mr. Patrick, Mr. Pownell, Bobby Pownell, Ollie Telby, Mr. McIntosh, Mr. Smalley, A.G. Miller himself, Ron Boxwell, my dad there, and then Mr. Murphy, the Inspector of Health there, the medical officer of health, I should say. Mr. Smalley there was the town clerk at the time, and his son is now a Baptist minister in Yorkshire somewhere, and he corresponded with us a couple of years ago, and he sent us his name tag. His father insisted that he wore a name tag every time he went to school. This time, and he was afraid that if the school was bombed, they wouldn't know his son from some of the others. So, but we've got his name tag now in our collection at the museum. This is in 1962. The war memorial had been moved from the junction of Church Street and the High Street for road improvements and moved here, but then moved back again in the 1990s when the road was improved once again. The front part of the poplars must have been added on to an older part, because this at the back is obviously much older than the front part, and it was quite a large estate really. This is a 1923 aerial photograph of Burton Latimer, and I've outlined the estate belonging to the Poplars. It was owned by Mr. Ashness in the 1850s and comprised all that. But then in about 1890, the shaded part was bought by Charles Barlow. This included the dairy and the post office, the site on which the post office was built, and eventually the school. And the school was purchased from Mr. Barlow and built there in 1899. This is an early photograph, illustration of the school. The stones were laid in 1898, and then the school opened in 1899. And as well as the foundation stones around the house, around the building, are also stones with initials on. Who AW was, I'm not quite sure. Who PJB was, I'm not quite sure. But W&W is obviously Whitney and Weston. I think they paid either 5 shillings or something like that to have an initial stone. And of course, this was a non-denominational school. It was built by the Baptists or the other non-denominationalists because they felt that the Church of England shouldn't have a monopoly of education in Burton Latimer, and it was funded by supporters of the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Wesleyans, and the other non-Anglicans. And it's ironic that it's now St Mary's Church of England school, but that's progress. This was part. This is my old home. This was a Grade 2 listed building, and at this time, when this photograph on the left was taken, it was Barlow's number 2 stores, and then this is what it was. I think this is a 1980s picture. Next door was the post office. This was land sold by Mr. Barlow to a Mr. Charles, who built a post office there in about 1903. And then this is looking the opposite direction. This is looking north, the other was looking south. This is in 1930s. And this was known as the High Causeway. You can see there are steps down from the houses, and then there's another 2 steps down to the road, which must mean there's quite a slope. And now all these have disappeared. You'll notice that there is a slope if you stand in the street and look up to civic centre or up to the library, you'll see it's quite a slope up there. Then the demolition started in 1969. By then, the co-op had built this shop on the corner here. This was Burton Latimer's first self-service store. This is Piggott's Lane. The Civic Centre and the Heritage Museum are just here, and the library a little bit further down. During the demolition, this was found. It was given to the Heritage Society, and we had it sent to Lincoln University, who called it a Victorian time capsule. It was found in the rubble, obviously hidden there by somebody, and the note reads, "This house was built by John Nichols, Burton Latimer, 1863. This property belongs to him and his daughter Mary Elizabeth. He is the owner of these 7 houses around here, and this was wrote by Mary Elizabeth, aged 11 years. Lincoln University have treated it, and now we've got it in our collection. And it's thought that the milk was a condensed milk tin. And I wonder whether it's time for tea break. Originally, the Wesleyan Chapel. It was built in 1835, but by 1873, the congregation of the Wesleyans had dropped so much that they couldn't maintain it, and it was sold to a gentleman called Abraham Ambler. Now there is, excuse me, there is a date stone on it, AA 1833. Now really, it's a bit of a mystery, that date stone, because we know that how the building itself wasn't put up until 1835, and he didn't buy it until 1873. The date stone doesn't say 73; it does say 33. So why there's a date stone like that, we don't really know. But he bought it, divided it into 2. But then, of course, more recently, it's been, early this century anyway, turned back into one building. A lot of you will remember the Hornses living there. This is Ambler's cottage, just speaking about Abraham Ambler. He lived in this cottage here, and his family lived in this cottage here. He had quite a lot of property. There was an Ambler's yard, which was round about where the band club is now, and he had other property. But he was a shoemaker with a lot of property. And there you see it in relation to the Britannia Club. It's now called Crofter's Cottage. It's a Grade 2 listed building. 159 High Street, now the home of John Peck. Until 1890, Mrs. Sophia Oliver lived here. She rented it. She was from a family at Hinnick House. But in 1890, it was purchased by the Kettering Guardians of the Poor, who decided that they didn't want young children to be kept in the workhouse at Kettering, where they might have been influenced by some unsavoury characters, and so they bought 159 and turned it into what they called a cottage home, but together with the master and the matron and other stuff. However, they outgrew that building, and in 1902 had this quite nice, quite lovely building put up to house the children. The girls were one side and the boys were the other side. It was built in the garden of 159, and here you see tried to do a diagram. This is 159. The houses were built in the garden. This building here, number 3, is still there. It was the coach house belonging to 159. And I believe that these houses were also built by whoever, not necessarily Mrs. Oliver, but whoever built the coach house also had these cottages built as well, because the coachman lived in this house here in the port. We'll go across the road. This is another view. You'll probably see just one car, but 1 or 2 other vehicles there. If you notice, look carefully there. I'm at the front, so I've got an advantage over it. But anyway, they've obviously got the workmen in. And we do tend to forget that these days, when every plumber or decorator has got a van to take his stuff around, back in the day, they didn't have such luxuries. And if they'd got a job to do, they had to take their hand cart and their wheelbarrow and their bike and go and get on with it. And also the baker's cart is here as well. And it reminded me, there's another photograph. This is a photograph of Church Street in the 1930s, I think. And once again, there's a tradesman's cart outside. Admittedly, it's outside the baker's, but I'm sure it's not a baker's cart. It's obviously they've got the plumber or the decorator or the builder in. Similarly, a parade in the 1930s along Alexander Street. And in amongst all the entrance of the parade is the Co-op baker's cart. And there it is with the bread on top. What the health and safety again say, I don't know. I think the bags are probably bags of flour. But here's the Co-op baker getting on with his job in amongst the parade. And then Pioneer Avenue in the 1930s, one car, and the Stop Me and Buy One man. There he is there talking to, whether he's selling him an ice cream or just passing the time of day, I don't know. But that's who he is. Also in Pioneer Avenue is Mrs. Carmel, who had a shop in Church Street. And obviously she was on her rounds, taking her groceries out to somebody living in Pioneer Avenue. And here she is at 45, shop was at 45 Church Street. And there she is with Mr. Carvel. Not the best dressed people in Burton Latimer, but there again, this was the 1930s. And this shop behind the number 45 Church Street was the first post office in Burton Latimer until it moved to the High Street in 1903. Another shop that's disappeared is on the corner of Cranford Road and Bird Street, number 32 Cranford Road. This lady is Mrs. Talbot, but many of you may remember the Mr. and Mrs. Dickens, or was it Dickinson? And they called it Dickie's Store Dickie's Stores at that time. You'll remember Roy Gilby and Arthur Gilby in their shop here, which is opposite the Pal Michael restaurant, now a home, another disappeared shop. And the Co-op shop, a bit further along, this was built in 1912 and closed in 1989. Here's another shot of it in 1972 with the Co-op butcher there, and Church Street Autos, Stan Firm's Church Street Autos on the corner of Pioneer Avenue there. And Osborne House here. And this part was, at some time, which is now a Beck's, was a greengrocers or fishmongers belonging to the Co-op. And these are some faces from the co-op. This lady, that's the co-op chemist, Diane Hyde, I think her name was. Yes, I can't remember the others. And then the co-op moved over to Barlow's. You saw Barlow's shop earlier on, opposite the War Memorial. When they closed the main stores, they moved over to what was Barlow's shop. And here the ladies are. I'm pleased to say these ladies are still about. Most of them anyway, rather alone. It is now a nursery. Brown shop on the corner of Alexander Street and Pine Street. Mr. Brown, Horace Sophocles Brown, Junior and Senior. That's Mr. Horace Sophocles Brown Senior, that's Junior. That's the gentleman that, if you've got a long memory, you will remember in the shop in Alexander Street. You will also not be surprised to learn that one of the things, as well as being a grocer's shop and hardware shop, they mended violins. They advertised violins. They even sell them as well. This photograph is taken outside the lines in Meeting Lane, which I mentioned earlier. The Burton Latimer Orchestra, 1912. Another faces that some of you will remember. Mrs. Piper and her daughter Daphne, and then Mr. Piper, who was the undertaker. And this is their shop. It's still there, opposite Sainsbury's. It's some studio now. I don't know what it is, but it seems to change every week. But it's still there. But I suspect the coffins have been taken away.
They've probably been used, John.
And then Mr. Yeoman and Mrs. Yeoman and Avis. Avis was supposed to be here tonight, but I'm afraid she's got COVID. And we send her our best wishes. This is in 1980 when Yeoman's closed. And then when they closed, Avis moved over the road to our shop. And there she is in our shop. Jocelyn is ours. Mrs. Jean Cox and my sister there. All looking very happy in their work. I'm sure they were. And next door was the post office I've already mentioned. The post office was here from 1903 to 1959. And then it moved over the road to part of the Barclays Bank building. This building was built as a coffee house. It didn't last long as a coffee house. It then became the Liberal Club. And then Barclays Bank bought it in 1922 and were there until, about 5 years ago? But in 1959, the post office moved over the road into this part of the building here and was there until 1975 when Mrs. Dacre retired. And here's Cyril Whitney, the postman, and Tommy from Isham, another postman. Got the bike clips on the notice. That's when postmen looked like postmen. Moving down the street to 119, this is Bill Downing and his wife, who kept a fishmongers and fish and chip shop. And when they moved out, Les Sharma moved in with his butcher's shop. Then further down the street, just past the Luke's Arms, the Packwoods, that's Mrs. Packwood Senior. This is Mrs. Packwood, what the Christian name was that. And then just past there, 129, this was a very early photograph of 129 High Street. It's that shop there. And here we have a parade in the 1950s, I think, and Mr. and Mrs. Furman, who had the shop and I'm pleased to say that Vivian's here tonight. That's her grandmother, and this is 1965 when the demolition was taking place. Just past those shops and the band club was this building, which was Wash Pit Farm, the home of George Mason when he had his garage on the site of now where Sainsbury's is. This is the High Causeway here, and George Mason lived there with his family. Originally it was called Wash Pit Farm, and this was yet another in the early 1900s. This was the home of another Burton Latimer doctor who had a surgery here. But then it was bought by Mr. Mason in the 1930s sometime, who established the garage where Sainsbury's is now. It's called Wash Pit Farm. Why, I don't know, except that I do remember a sheep dip in the hollow in Pine Road, just down here. And I suspect that the farmland in the back here all belonged to that farm, hence it was called Wash Pit Farm. This is a photograph of London House, and this was the police station at one stage, and I think people remember seeing this before. The sweeps here, then the sweeps chimney poking out, the sweeps brush poking out the chimney. These children here are all carrying unmade leather shoes, and this vehicle here, he's not the sweep, he is a Mr. East, who had a factory in Kettering. He was a photographer, and there's no doubt at all that he took this photograph. He went around the villages to collect, to deliver and collect outwork for a shoe factory. And while he was out, he would take photos of the locality. Getting back to Higham Road, here we have it, looking in the opposite direction towards Burton Latimer. It does look like this now, the health centre just here, and masses of houses here. And in 2011, of course, they started building here over this side, and found that there was a Roman settlement there, an Anglo-Roman settlement. And the Albion Archaeology, who did the survey there, who did the investigation, have recently made this picture of what it used to look like. That was between AD 200 and AD 300. And then 100 years or so later, it had grown like that. And to put it into perspective, this is where it is. Excuse the wind turbines, but that's the bypass along there. This is Higham Road on the right-hand side, and this is the brook that runs along the bottom. So that gives you some idea of where it was. So if there's anybody here who lives up in that estate, that was what it looked like about 1600 years ago. They found 47 graves on the site, which was quite a lot apparently for that sort of settlement. And the archaeologists, after they'd finished, made this illustration, made this drawing of what they thought a burial would look like at that time. Now, this is the burial. Where they went to after the funeral, I don't know. But these days, they go to the Old Victoria. And this is the Old Victoria, about 100 years ago, when it was called it was named the Horse and Groom, known to most as the Jockey. And this is Spring Gardens, Bakehouse Lane, and this is what it looks like now. There's the Old Victoria through the trees there, the parish church up here. This photograph was taken during the war. It was a favourite haunt of American servicemen who cycled over We cycled over from Grafton Underwood to play darts, and they had a shield made called the Friendship Shield, which they contested between 1944 and 1946. And here we have the servicemen with their hosts, with the regulars at the pub. There's Bobby Pound, who you saw on one of the other photos at the opening of the council offices. This photograph appears in Douglas Ashby's book, Portrait of a Certain Place. He just calls it a gathering at the Horse and Groom, and no one really knew what it was. There are lots of familiar faces, but an awful lot of unknown faces. There's Joe Evans, the poacher there with his dog, Chip King here, Mr. Bache there, and another Bache there. But we didn't really know what it was. And then it turned out, through somebody getting in touch with us, that the landlord at the time was a chap called Billy Dales. He came from the northeast, and he'd got a brother up there in a miners' social club. And they decided to pay Billy Dales a visit and raise a bit of money somehow. And this is a parade. This is going past Windmill Farm. There's Les Gaisley, not Les Gaisley, Gaisley there with the camera. And these are the guys all dressed up going up Cranford Road. And so we now know that it was a fundraising effort. And they finished up, I think this is in the field at the end of Woodcock Street, because there was a football pitch there at one stage. And here they are, they're either playing bowls or boule, vowels or quoits, which wouldn't be unusual because there were quoits teams attached to pubs and clubs in Burton Latimer. This is an advertisement when they sold Duke's Arms in 1890, saying it had got a quoits ground. That's the Duke's Arms. And this is the Duke's Arms a little bit later than that, in the High Street. The Duke's Arms here, the post office there. At that time, this shop on the corner of Duke Street was owned by a Mr. Chapman, who had a general grocer's and hardware store there. And along here, I've been talking about the poplars. You can see why it was called the poplars, because there's a great poplar tree in front of the house there. Another pub. Now this is a different photograph of the Red Cow. This was taken in the 1930s. Once again, the Thatcher's Arms. And then the Wagon and Horses in Kettering Road. You'll see how narrow the road is. This was before the 1950s, when all this was cleared out on the right. They've not even a footpath here then. And this is it in 1996, soon, not long before it was closed by, it was a Charles Wells pub, and it was closed then. It went through different hands, but of course now it's just a private residence. It was once kept by a gentleman called Sid Coleman, I think his name was. And this was called Coleman's Green. This is the opposite side of the road. This is Sid Coleman's workshop here. The Wagon and Horses here. This is Barry Noble's and his brother. Barry Noble's grandfather kept the Wagon and Horses. And this is, I threw a bit of this photograph when I got this photograph, because it shows two cottages that belong to Redland Farm. I remember me saying that Mr. Osborne owned Redland Farm, but these were two farm cottages lived in by farm workers before. This is a photograph before they were pulled down. And there's a car show, well no, it's a car lot here now. And on here, all this ground here was later bought by Stan Firmin, who put Church Street Autos on here. One of the sites anyway. And this is an iconic picture. Most of us have seen this picture before. This is Kettering Road leading into High Street. There's the co-op building there. All these houses have gone, both sides, except these one or two just here. And this was in a great blizzard in 1916. And we didn't realise, but there were other photos of this blizzard which appeared on eBay. And this is one of them. This is the shop on the corner of Station Road and Kettering Road, known as Norton's Corner. He was a baker, and this is it without the snow. This, once again, you can see, this is a later photograph, and another one, still very narrow, but at least they've got a footpath here now. This was pulled down in 1939 to make the corner a lot safer. And this building, this was a shop, but this is what it looks like now. Known as Pateman's Corner, when it was Pateman's shop. And this is back up Station Road, that same blizzard in 1916. It's full of snow there, but it's full of cars now, isn't it? I mean, every street you see in these old photographs, it's noticeable that there are no cars in them. Then after the blizzard came the thaw, and this is the floods caused by the melting snow. See the telegraph poles are leaning over. There's one laying on its side there. And this is taken from the railway bridge looking south. And you can see the hurdy-gurdy bridge just in the distance there. And looking on from the bridge, this is the bridge again. This is the railway station. In those days, there were footpaths down from the bridge, down to the platforms from the bridge, either side. There's one that side, there's one the other side. This, on the notice board, it says Isham for Burton Latimer, so we know that this was before 1923. Burton Latimer was created an urban district in 1923. And then the board was changed to Burton Latimer for Isham. We became a town 100 years ago next year, and I hope there's going to be a celebration. There are sidings connected with the railway station, and here we have lots of coal trucks with Burton Latimer Cooperative Society on them. It's also used by Ellis and Everard. There are sidings also into the Wallace's corn mill that it was at the time. You can see there's one here with Midland Railway on it. The only thing was that they could bring the trucks so far that the bridge over the mill stream wouldn't hold a railway engine, so they had to have a horse to pull the trucks. And you could just see a little tiny pony just there. I suspect it only pulled one at a time, but that was the means of transporting it into the factory. Another siding went into Gray's pits. These pits were at the back of, this is about the 1950s. These are the houses in the Station Road, the Service Road. And these are in West Avenue. And all this was, they were mining silicous clay then, which was used to line furnaces. Very damp, and you can see why the Poppy's football ground is always getting damp when you look at this here. Because this is now where the Poppy's play, and Latimer, the Latimer sports people are. And the railway went from that quarry under Polwell Lane, and there's the bridge under Polwell Lane, and through here to a siding, and here these are the wagon where the wagons went, and they tipped the clay into these trucks, which then went onto the main line. And two lots of families were employed here. This is John and Reg Lewin, and Ernie and Joe Randall here, working at the Grays. And Mr. Gray also owned the swimming pool. His wagon sheds are just there behind. This is the diving platform here, and his sheds were just there. And he built this in about 1932, and it was called the Isbrook Swimming Pool. A swimming pool essentially for those of refined taste who would appreciate the best London and continental standards of behaviour and cleanliness. Well, I hope they did. This is the Spanton family enjoying the facilities. The Spantons actually were farmers, and they farmed from the laurels in Church Street that you saw earlier on. It was called the Isbrook Swimming Pool. It wasn't connected to the Isbrook, but that's what they called it. But the Isbrook did run, it's on the western boundary of Burton Latimer. It runs from the Kettering boundary right down to Pineman, and this is a very early photo of the River Eyes or the Isbrook. And one of the mills, 1086, one of them was the South Mill, which was a corn mill right up to the early 1900s, and then it became a tannery. And this is what it looked like when it was owned by the Groom family in the 1930s. Unfortunately, there was a serious fire in the 1930s, and it had to be demolished. And it looks like that now, Mill Cottage. And the other mill, of course, was Wallace's Mill. This was the North Mill mentioned in the Domesday Book. And it's interesting to note, really, that there's been a mill on this site, for all those hundreds of years. Not always a corn mill or a flour mill. That it was a carpet mill, a worsted mill, a mustard mill, and all sorts of things they've done. A silk mill, but it's still there, and now it's Weetabix. And this is a 1932 photograph taken from the railway bridge. We're looking at the mills. And in 1936, the Weetabix company was formed. And this is from a Wedgwood plate brought out by Weetabix to mark its 50th anniversary in 1986. Some ladies working in the packing room. Now, of course, no hand touches it now, but these, you can see all these ladies working, packing Weetabix. I think this was just post-war. And these are the ladies working in Sterling Metals, which is now the Almas factory. During the war, they manufactured incendiary bombs. And you can see the casings down here by the side. Over a third of the bombs manufactured for the RAF came from Burton Latimer during the war, which is a depressing sight for some, but inspiration to others. And some more ladies at work here. These are working for Wallace and Linnell. And this is the factory that Mr. James built. This is Rosebank, which I mentioned earlier, and this is the clothing factory which Mr. James built behind the Pagoda House, just off the High Street. And now here they are now advertised as luxury apartments. The factory I mentioned earlier, the Ideal factory, this is a 1961 photograph of a parade going past the Ideal clothing factory. That's the factory you can see from Station Road. And this is what it looks like now. There's the factory in the background there. Another old clothing factory is this one, which was Thorno Clarkson's. This operated until just post-war, and then it was taken over as a shoe factory by individual shoes. This building here was actually its air raid shelter during the war and been converted. It's now Langham Industrial Controls. This is what it was like when it was used as a clothing factory between the wars. Another reused, this is the shoe factory. This is behind number 9 Alexander Street. There was a shoe factory until well after the Second World War. This factory was facing Station Road. It's now gone. There are 2 houses just here. It's got Buckby Brothers on it, but it's actually built by the Kettering Cooperative Clothing Company in 1902. It was a clothing factory right up until just after the Second World War. This is an aerial photograph. This is Station Road. This is Pioneer Avenue. The Co-op Clothing Factory premises stretch from Station Road right through to Pioneer Avenue. They had a tennis court here at one stage, and I didn't mention, but the Ideal Clothing Factory also had a tennis court in front of theirs. And this is Buckby Brothers, this is Coleman's Green, as I mentioned earlier. The wagon and horses over the road. This is Kettering Road, and there was a drive up here called Buckby's Drive, leading up to the factory. It was separate from this at one stage. And these are ladies, this is early in the 1900s, working at Buckby Brothers. And you see all the leather bits on the floor, all scattered around. I don't think they ever swept up. And I used to deliver milk up to this factory right up to when it closed. And I was always getting punctures, but they never swept up then either, getting punctures from all the tacks from the shoemaker. Coles Boot Company, this is a 1971 photo of Coles Boot Company, the other large shoe manufacturer in Burton Latimer. This is Spencer Street down this side, Yeoman Street at the bottom here, Piggott's Lane, and on the extreme right here is where the health centre was built, and the library just here. And the fire station was built over here somewhere. And here are some young ladies that worked for Coles Boot Company. Another big shoe company in Burton was Whitney and Wesley. And these are in Finan Street. This is in the 1920s. Again, just 2 cars on the street. And that was a gate at the top of the road that led into the allotments. And Mr. Harold Timpson used to live up the top here, and he had a bus, and that's the bus park there. This is another iconic picture. Many of you will have seen it before, of the Whitney and Wesley workers outside the factory. This was before the First World War. And here they are. And I often wonder how many of these poor souls went to war. Some of them wouldn't have come back, and some of them came back injured. By all those men there, some of them must have gone, and some of them must have never come back. Which brings us back to where we started, the War in 1922. And thank you for watching. Well, I hope it made sense, folks.